Good afternoon. We're back, and I'm happy to welcome two friends who are both very knowledgeable and passionate about our next topic, namely how the Greek fire has shaped U.S. foreign policy to this day. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Paul Glastris, the editor of Washington Monthly, who was a communications advisor to President Bill Clinton. And with me here in Zappeion is Aristotle Tziampiris, professor of international relations at the University of Piraeus. Let me take a moment to explain the title. At the time of the Greek Revolution, the Monroe Dogma set the stage for American neutrality and non-entanglement on European affairs. For some historians, it marked the start of what they see as the lack of support by the US government to Greece. We will debate this, of course, during our panel, but in any case, no matter what, the American public did support the Greek cause, creating a tradition of fervent Philhellenes who were supporting Greece in the Congress, from Senator Daniel Webster to Senator Bob Menendez today. Paul, you recently wrote an article on what President Biden can learn from the Greek Revolution. We cannot wait to hear your take, so the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you, my friend, and thank you to the organizers of this tremendous forum. I wish I could be there in person as I was a few years ago. It's a fantastic event and very much needed in the world. Every statesman, certainly every president of the United States, or almost every, must find a way to balance realpolitik and idealism, especially the United States, because this is a nation founded on ideas, ideas of liberty. It's one of the binding elements of the country, maybe the binding element of the country. So idealism, belief in democracy, belief that the United States is stands as a beacon of freedom, can't really be separated practically from the needs of a country to engage in foreign policy in a cold-blooded manner to advance its own interests and power. So this has been going on for years, and centuries really, and it first came really to the fore in 1821. Because at that point, the Monroe administration was developing, as you said, the Monroe Doctrine. This was a couple of years before it was formally announced, but already President James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who would follow him in the White House as president, was formulating the basic ideas, as you said. The idea was the European colonial powers must keep their hands off of the Western Hemisphere and allow new republics to be born. But in return, the United States pledged not to involve itself in the affairs of Europe. In March of 25th, 1821, there occurred an event which complicated that foreign policy. And that was the rise of Greek democracy, essentially, the start of the War of Independence. And suddenly the public was crazy in favor of US recognition of the new Greek government. And that would have contravened the basic new doctrine that the president and his cabinet were trying to formulate. And so for the next 10 years, the government in Washington had to dance around this problem. And the way that they crafted policy was to say, formally, the United States will not recognize Greece, will not so much as send a representative, but nor will it stand in the way of mass public demonstrations and activities in support of the Greek struggle. In fact, US naval vessels accompanied and protected private US ships laden with weapons and humanitarian aid. So back then, what happened was, and this is I argue in the article, was the first attempt by a U.S. government to balance these two issues. In a sense, Monroe, then Adams, privatized the idealistic element of U.S. foreign policy, and thereby hoping to continue negotiating with the Ottomans for trade advantages, thereby hoping not to engage the European monarchies in actions that could limit U.S. ability to colonize the rest of North America. And you can argue it worked brilliantly, or you can argue that the U.S. missed a great opportunity to send a message that it supports freedom.
I'm afraid we've lost you.
Seeing that today.
He's back.
Paul, can you hear us?
Yes. Yes.
Please continue.
Did
We lost you for a moment.
Okay. Well, I don't know where you lost me, but let me just say, to follow up, we are seeing that balance happen today. Just last week, the Biden administration announced that it would lift patent protections on the coronavirus, the corona vaccine. That was something that many had called on them to do months ago, including my magazine, because without vaccines, the world, millions will die and great turmoil will happen. But that is a disadvantage to U.S. pharmaceutical companies. The Biden administration waited until a political moment, and then it did it. But you can imagine an administration that would not do it. So in everything, in many cases in foreign policy, a president must decide how to balance realpolitik with democratic values.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether.
Yes, I'm happy to speak more, but I don't want to steal time from the professor.
Okay, for sure. All right. Then we'll turn to Tziampiris for his take. And Ari, I believe it's official, so we might as well announce it here that you're one of the most knowledgeable Greeks I know on all things America, and you will be directing a new master's on American Studies in partnership with New York University starting this fall. So I believe it's the first of its kind for a public Greek university. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
But we would love to hear your take on the Monroe Doctrine and respond to Paul as well.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be on this panel. And thank you, Katerina, for organizing this. And I have to say, being on the same panel with Paul Glastris means I'm moving up in this world. So it makes me doubly happy. Allow me, though, to start with some preliminary observations. And then I'll take a few minutes to discuss some lessons that can be derived from this episode in American history and Greek-American relations. First of all, it should be kept in mind that early in the 19th century, America was not the colossus dominating global politics familiar with contemporary audiences. The US had a small standing army, a population akin to Greece's in the 21st century, and comprised of fewer than half the states that are in the Union today. Immensely ambitious and with undisputable potential, the new republic faced internal, sectional, and ideological divisions, especially over the atrocious and inhumane peculiar institution that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Furthermore, America could simply not rival in power most of the leading European empires and states. Hence, although the issue of American recognition was important to the Greek revolutionaries, from the perspective of the then international distribution of power, it was not decisive in the manner, for example, that the Truman Doctrine was in 1949. While approaching this episode in American diplomatic history and domestic politics, it should also be kept in mind that the Greek Revolution erupted out half a century after the American Revolution. The memories, and to an extent the spirit of '76, were still alive, as were several of the major founding fathers, including John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, who resided in the White House, then called the Executive Residence. George Washington was not a distant memory or a monument. He cast a long shadow of greatness, precedent, and policy advice to his political epigones, perhaps none more so than Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. This, as we will see, has consequences. Let me also quickly add that we would do a disservice if we try and approach this episode through the prism of actions pursued by Philhellenes and anti-Greeks, not to dispute the fact that there were both. However, such an approach, I think, commits two errors. First, it assumes that the recognition of the Greek Revolution was somehow a standalone issue of paramount importance. In reality, as we will see, the still young American Republic had to face, often from a position of relative weakness, a host of interconnected foreign policy challenges. And secondly, it ultimately does disservice to the great American statesmen of that era. Leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, Monroe, Hamilton, John Quincy Adams are certainly not beyond reproach, and hagiographies must be resisted at all costs. But you simply say, oh, Jefferson was pro-French, Hamilton was pro-British. It does a disservice to them because they were fundamentally, first and foremost, pro-American. They just pursued the national interest in different ways. So what lessons do I derive from this episode? The first one, I will not belabor much, and it's that there has always been an awesome asymmetry of power in Greek-American relations. And this was true even in the 19th century, and it's still true to this very day. My second conclusion is that public opinion in U.S. foreign policy making may be of great importance. The Greek fever shows that domestic politics and public opinion can play a large role in American foreign policy making. This realization is probably first evinced with the Genet Affair and continues to more contemporary developments, such as the Vietnam War or the Second Iraq War. However, although Americans can be vociferous and organized broadly, it should be stressed, there's a caveat here, that they are extremely selective about the issues that they decide to elevate as being part of the national, domestic, political debate and discourse. A convergence of several diverse factors is necessary to capture the American public's attention and imagination. The Greek Revolution clearly did so, but the Serbian Revolution that preceded the Greek Revolution, not so much. This selectivity is still applicable to this very day. Furthermore, although the American public can become an essential part of the foreign policy decision-making process, this is not necessarily decisive. And the Greek fire actually proves this because the Monroe administration did not recognize the Greek Revolution. Another conclusion that I think is relevant to this very day is that from a U.S. perspective, Greek-American relations have almost never been just or even primarily about Greece. The non-recognition of the Greek Revolution as a result of the enunciation of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine was related to the U.S. responding to the Tropau Protocol, George Canning's overture for a common stance on the Holy Alliance's purported and feared actions in Spanish America. Unjustified, but they feared them nonetheless. The entire issue of when and how to recognize the new states of Spanish America and the possible effects that all these actions could have had on domestic unity, and especially in the fanatically slave-holding South. The same applies to the Truman Doctrine. Containment of world communism was the goal, and not just the future of Greece and Turkey. Or today, when in my opinion, Greek-American relations are seen through the prism of regional great power competition and the desire to combat the malfeasance of certain actors. Since since the 19th century, Greek-American relations from the U.S. perspective have never been just about Greece. There have been some exceptions, but that is a useful rule, and we learned this from the very beginning. And then my next lesson is that doctrines matter. The intellectual argument in favor of non-entanglement or neutrality in European foreign affairs actually predates America's War of Independence and culminates with the Monroe Doctrine. This tradition includes the Neutrality Proclamation of 1783, Jay's 1794 Treaty, Washington's 1796 Farewell Address, and so on and so forth. Let us listen to Common Sense by Thomas Paine, published in February 1776. Any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and sets us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. As Europe is our market for trade, we ought to form no partial connection with any part of it. It is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions. Or let us turn to Washington's Farewell Address. It actually, everyone thinks, when they think, to the extent that they do, Farewell Address, non-entangling alliances. This phrase belongs with Play It Again, Sam, and Elementary, My Dear Washington Elementary. It's actually not in the Farewell Address. It's in Jefferson's first inaugural address. But let's listen to what Washington actually says. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. And in his famous 4th of July message, speech, John Quincy Adams famously said, "But she," meaning America, "goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She's the champion and vindicator only of her own." What I'm trying to say here is that the doctrine or the thinking of neutrality or non-entanglement goes back. If it was an act, it was a long-standing act. I should quickly add that the policy of neutrality is erroneously taken for a policy of isolationism. This is a mistake. Whenever it was applied to specific policy decisions and official documents, it usually came with sufficient diplomatic wiggle room, exceptions, and a healthy dose of pragmatism. Even Washington's Farewell Address says no permanent alliances. He doesn't counsel against short-term alliances. And anyway, if you want to trade with the world, which is really what we're getting here, you can't do that if you're isolationist. The Monroe Doctrine fits perfectly well with this tradition of neutrality that was more than half a century old by 1823. In fact, it completes it by providing to it the necessary corollary for the Western Hemisphere. And it's very interesting that based on John Quincy Adams' diary, the first version of what became known as the Monroe Doctrine actually recognized Greece, the first draft, not the one that was published. We don't have the first draft. It has not been located. Clearly the Monroe Doctrine had consequences for Greece, as did the Truman Doctrine, and this is why I'm anxiously waiting to see the possible emergence of a new doctrine dealing with the rise of China and see how that affects Greece. My last point, was it a lost opportunity for the United States, the non-recognition of the Greek Revolution? Well, popular American support proved insufficient to overcome considerations of national, political, and commercial interests and produce the desired recognition. However, the Greek fire probably was sufficient to prevent closer ties with the Ottoman Empire. And an official trade alliance was only signed with the Ottoman Empire was only signed in 1832, after Greece had won its independence. Paul Glastris has actually argued that, and I'm quoting Paul, Monroe and Adams were too clever by half. Ottoman officials couldn't make sense of the mixed public-private messages they were getting from the American regarding the Greek situation. This assessment is correct. However, I would add that it excludes the immensely profitable opium trade with China. The opium was taken in from the Ottomans. That was very important to Boston merchants and to the New England economy. And Thomas Handisart Perkins is the key merchant, and we can take this up in discussion. Furthermore, it seems that America had about $800,000 worth of annual trade with the Ottoman Empire. That continued, not so much with the war-torn Greece. So how do I actually, where do this leaves us? It has also, Paul Glastris also makes, again, the correct argument that the great powers of Europe, and I'm quoting Paul again, were in no position to reassert the colonial authority or stop America's westward expansion. It was feared in Monroe's cabinet that this was the case. We now know better. By playing it safe, the administration missed an opportunity to make an official statement to the world that the United States stood against the rising tyranny of the time. I now have to wear my heavy academic hat and say, this is interesting, it's probably correct, but it belongs to the realm of the counterfactual, since we do not know what diplomatic counter moves the enunciation of the Monroe Doctrine with Greek recognition could have provoked. Here's how I conclude. In retrospect, we're on firmer ground, realizing that what is truly surprising is not that the Monroe administration did not recognize the Greek revolutionary effort, but how close it came to doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Paul, I will give you the floor to respond. Was it a missed opportunity at the time? But also, if I may, you've raised the point of you've underlined the idealism versus realism challenge in international affairs, the struggle. Would you say that it has shaped bilateral relations to these days? And I'm referring here, for example, to as recently as in the 1970s, the fact that during the military junta, the US administration was not very open in condemning the junta at the time.
Well, that is a great example of an administration leaning hard to the realism side and more or less ignoring the idealism side. And I don't think it, in the end, was beneficial to the United States. What happened afterwards, as everyone in this audience knows, is great turmoil in Greece, tremendous anti-Americanism that was a headache in the management of the Cold War for years after that. So a more balanced approach by the Kissinger and Nixon would have been very, very wise. But I think you're right that the balance has persisted throughout the bilateral relationship. Katerina, you've written very important work on the efforts of the Obama administration to convince Europe to lift some of the debt burdens. Was that idealism? Was that practicality? I'd argue it was both. And that, often it's the case that people with idealistic motives argue on practical terms. And people pushing realistic visions argue that it is the more humanitarian course. So these things are deeply intertwined. Aristotle, I agree with you that it is speculative and counterfactual to wonder what would have happened had the United States been more open in its support of Greece. I just can't get out of my mind the thought of how history would have been different if at the naval battle of where the European powers sunk the Turkish Navy off the west coast of the Peloponnese, if there hadn't been an American fighter American ships involved, how different history might have been. And what cost would the United States have paid? Who can say? My guess is very little. And the glory would have been wonderful. And history might well have been different had the lone democracy in the world, other than Greece, been seen as openly fighting for that democracy. So yeah, and I agree that we can't know, but I think it's a point worth speculating, because in politics, we have to make decisions. Leaders have to make decisions. Citizens have to make decisions without knowing what the future will be. And so these kind of counterfactual exercises, I think, are helpful.
Thank you. And I have a question for you both, actually. Ari, let me start with you, because it seems to me that the central tension that Paul has described of American statecraft between the need to make cold-blooded decisions that defend U.S. interests and the belief that the U.S. should also defend and advance democracy and human rights might be better managed when interests and values are aligned. Is there such a moment in bilateral relations? And to put it in a different way, are all philhellenes really still just idealists?
Okay, so this is a very good question. I'll start with the second part. I think that with philhellenes, going back to the 19th century, clearly there's an idealism or a romantic take on Greece and the Greek past. That is clearly there, I cannot deny it. But I'm also absolutely certain that in their minds, there was not just a convergence of interests, there was a harmony of interests between what the US stood for and what Greece wanted to become. So again, it's a combination. You have the idealistic part, but listen, let me put it another way. I can't believe any American citizen saying, okay, I'm now going to be a philhellene and I'm going to help the Greeks, and in this way, I'm really going to damage the national interests of America. I'm going to harm my country. No. So I think in their minds, there's a harmony of interests, and they act based on that understanding. And let me also say that there's a lot of focus in Greece on the Greek diaspora, justifiably so, but philhellenes are actually very influential and sometimes make an even bigger difference, which is, I'm very happy that we now have a museum on philhellenes, and there's talk about having an international council of philhellenes. Took us 200 years, but we're getting there.
Paul, what's your take?
Well, I completely agree that as much focus as we have on the diaspora, and I would love to see more because I am a member of the diaspora, if you look at history, it wasn't Greek Americans who were pivotal in the bilateral relations. It was philhellenes or non-philhellenes. It was the Americans who went and fought in Greece on the ground, Samuel Gordon Howe and George Jarvis, who were pivotal players in that relationship. Their writings, their letters home was how the American public kept the story, learned of the progress of that war. And literally Americans for 10 years were riveted to their newspapers, rooting for the Greeks to overthrow tyranny. And those were, English, Anglo-Saxon Americans. The most powerful advocate of Greece, arguably in the country right now, is Senator Menendez from New Jersey, who is absolutely not a Greek, but whose vision overlaps with that of a lot of Greek American organizations. So, Ari said the Serbian Revolution predated the American Revolution, but didn't have the resonance with the American public. Things Greek tend to have resonance with the American public to this day. Maybe not as much as some would like, but they do. And so there is a strength in that capacity that Greece has to engage the sympathies and the interests, not just of the diaspora, but of the American people broadly.
Thank you, Paul, for this. And I can't help but go back to the question that you both raised, actually, about interests and values aligning. During this time that we learned a lot about the Greek Revolution, I heard Roderick Beaton, the famous historian, of course, saying that Alexandros Mavrokordatos actually sent a letter to the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, in 1823, noting the importance of a strong, independent Greece to avoid Russia filling the gap of a crumbling Ottoman Empire in the region. And I couldn't help but think of the East Med Act and the reasons behind its creation. That was, of course, driven by the need to work with democratic allies in a region that addresses the great power competition that is very much alive in this part of the world. So I'm wondering if you see these. I would like to go back to the dogma that Aris also mentioned that he would like to see develop, or wondering if it would be developed, and what the Greek position will be in such a balance of power in the region. What do you think?
Should I have go
sure.
first? Well, there's, again, I guess a theme of this topic, but also a major theme in American foreign policy making, is the fact that idealism and realism coexist. And as Paul said before, sometimes one of the two prevail a bit more, but they always coexist. You can't get rid of either one. They're there. And I think we now live in a very happy state where American interests and American ideals, Greek ideals and Greek interests are converging, which is why we have the renewed military defense agreement, the East Med Act, energy cooperation, what's happening in Alexandroupolis, countless military exercises. This could be a panel on its own. So we're there right now. My hunch is that sooner rather than later, the United States will have to develop a more concrete strategy to deal with China. For example, what is the goal of the United States vis-a-vis China? I assume that's going to become far crystallized in coming months or years. At that point, I suspect that Greece is going to have to make some choices. And in fact, Greece already is making choices. Look at which company it decided not to use for 5G. Huawei is not going to be used by Greece. So what I think is going to happen is that if there's a new doctrine, it's going to mean policy consequences for Greece. But unlike the Truman Doctrine or the Monroe Doctrine, Greece and Europe are not going to be at the epicenter of what is coming, I think, in the 21st century.
Thank you. And Paul, what's your take on this? Will Greece have to choose?
I hope not. I agree with Ari that there is a rather rare in our lifetime harmony between Greek interests and ideals and American interests and ideals. I also agree with both of you that there needs to be a new doctrine. In the current issue of the Washington Monthly, former Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark has an essay that I think might be a stand-in for that doctrine, that Biden doctrine that could be created. And what he argues is for a NATO for the US, European, and UK economies, a new organization, a new trade treaty, alliance, we don't know what form it might take, where we recognize that as in 1821, we're living in an era of rising authoritarianism, both in the world, primarily in the form of China, but also in assertive Russia, but in our own shores, with authoritarian tendencies both in Europe and in the United States. And we need an integrated economic plan to lift wages of the dispirited and angry working classes who feel quite rightly that they've been cut off from growth, but also to create an organization that checks Chinese and Russian predation on technology, on trade, on human rights, on environmental degradation. And so, you know, quite different from 1821, we are already an integrated nation. We've long ago abandoned neutrality for good reason and created NATO and other organizations that have kept the peace. But we need more. And I think that idea that General Clark has put forth is worth folks taking a look at. Whether the politics are right now, I don't know, but I think the vision is.
Thank you. And if I may follow up just briefly, since you've also stressed the need to balance the demands of principle and practicality in foreign affairs, where do you think this leaves bilateral relations? And could we say that we move towards a time of more interdependence between the West, between powers like the US and actual smaller countries like Greece in the new era?
Well, I think if you look at Greek-US relations, they improved remarkably under Obama. They did not deteriorate under Donald Trump. One of the few consistencies through the Trump 4 years was in US-Greece relationship. In fact, things got measurably better. And now under Biden, who is himself quite a Philhellene, after many, many years in U.S. politics, he knows how to, he's very, very fluent in that in a way that, you know, Trump was not. I think you're only going to see a continuation, if not a strengthening of that. So I think that tells you that there really are a convergence of interests and values in that relationship now.
Thank you, Paul. And what about you, Ari? Do you think that there might be more interdependence looking forward in this bilateral relationship?
I think there's going to be more cooperation as we move forward, because right now in the 21st century, when you look at European Union, European countries, and the United States, and what is going on in the rest of the world, I think that common interests and common values stand out. And in that sense, I expect, especially with the new administration, the new Biden administration, enhanced cooperation. And Greece fits in, even though it's a smaller country, does have a key geographical position. So I expect more cooperation based on values and interests. And that's the sweet spot right there.
Thank you both very much. Paul Glastris joining us from Washington, D.C., Aristotle Tziampiris here in Zapion. Thank you. I would like to invite you all to stay tuned for our keynote address by Professor Nikiforos Diamandouros, who is part of a generation of academics that at a difficult time for Greek democracy in the 70s revisited the Greek Revolution from abroad, from New York, actually, as a historical event of global significance with the tools of modern social science. And he's the best person to speak about Greece's relationship to the West from a historical, macro-historical perspective. And to my mind, the title of his address, From Metakenosis to Dialogue, suggests a hopeful evolution to a mature democracy that is self-confident and hence open and interconnected with the world, in dialogue with the West, not just absorbing the latest tendencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.